Redditors who have worked around death and burial, what's your best ghost story? I used to be a driver for a funeral home corporation. Like, drive the hearse and pick up the bodies. Never had anything creepy happen. A few funny things, a few traumatic things. In general, it was a chill job. However, I did get incredibly uncomfortable one night picking up a man who died at home. He still had the defibrillator leads on his chest and his eyes were closed, which is unusual because the eyes are always open. He just looked like he was asleep or unconscious, not rigid or pale or anything. I just had this sinking feeling for about half an hour in traffic that he was going to suddenly gasp and wake up in the body bag. Then it hit me. That would be the coolest thing ever. I'd take him home and he'd be back with his family, so I just kind of drove slowly and turned up some music and sang along and talked to him. When I got him to the funeral home, I left him out of the cooler for about an hour while I did paperwork and played on my phone. When I got another call, I checked on him and his limbs had started to stiffen. I was kind of bummed. I put him in the cooler and went on my next call. Comment 2. Honestly, the only creepy thing that happened when I worked in the morgue is that one of the staff killed himself in there, and I just can't imagine wanting to die in this cold, gray place surrounded by corpses. Reply. Well, when in Rome, I suppose. Comment 3. Corpses move when you cremate them. People who don't know this get spooked a lot. Reply. In mortuary school, I had a dream about embalming my dad, but he was still alive. My classmates tried to tell me it was just tissue gas and he wasn't actually alive and get my shit together. Then, when I cut him open, he gasped a faint, "Help me." So the next day, I had to go to the lab, my second case ever, and I told my classmates about the dream. We had a chuckle about it and started to work on our body. An old lady had pretty severe arthritis, so when I was breaking the rigor, she literally clutched my hand. It's the only time I ever got some serious heebie-fucking-jeebies. I had to step away from her and collect myself for a minute. When my father worked at a mortuary, there was one incident where the muscles contracted so that the head turned and looked at him through the little window. The only time he ever felt spooked working there. Next comment. During my apprenticeship, I worked at a funeral home said to be haunted by an old funeral director assistant who had a heart attack in the building and died. All he ever did was mess with the chapel lights, and if you called him out, something like, "John, the family is coming, please don't," they would return to normal. Not really sure if I believe it was really haunted, but saying something always fixed the issue, so I kept doing it my entire time there. Reply. I love stories of people talking to ghosts. My childhood home was haunted, and the door to my grandparents' living room would crack open very slightly on its own. My granddad would always say something like, "Come on in and sit down, mate," and the door would open further, and my grandma would yell at him. A lot of my extended family lives in their own houses on the same property and visit each other a lot. My great-aunt's house is said to be the place where their ghost lives regularly. He's a guy from the early 1900s with one of those older hats, and he likes to make footstep sounds, appear at the end of the hallway, and open doors a crack. My great-aunt is very strictly against smoking in her home, so when she does smell it, she's pretty sure it's him, so she will shout at him to knock it off, and the smell goes away. She's the only one who he will listen to about this. Once in a while, he will follow another family member to a different house on the property when they're leaving the main house, and he'll stay there for a couple of days. He keeps on with opening doors and stuff. My aunt hates it though because she can tell when he's around and looking at her while she's in the shower. I don't 100% believe in ghosts, but I like to believe in this one because there are a lot of accounts of this guy, and it would explain some incidents I've seen before at the main house. Plus, just about every grandchild who was raised on that property and has been in that house while growing up has seen him. Not a funeral home, but I worked at one of the last booth homes for pregnant girls in the early 2000s. Lots of dead babies and some dead moms in the history of that campus. We had any number of creepy things happen, to the point that I brought it up in a staff meeting and the social worker just said, "Oh, Must be the time to have the building blessed again. But what stuck with me was the baby swing. I came into the living room and found it swinging by itself hours after all the teenagers were in bed. Now, this was an ancient mechanical wind-up swing. You had to turn a crank to start it. There was no electricity involved. There was no way it just started on its own. And there it was, swinging full force. I was completely terrified, but I just said, "If you want to swing, I will be happy to wind up the swing for you. But when you do it on your own, it frightens people." Every night for the rest of the year or so I worked there, I wound that swing up and let it go. I told other staff members, and I believe they did the same. I like to think it was a sweet baby ghost who just wanted attention, and we gave it attention. Later, they closed the program for parenting teens and made the whole place a homeless shelter. Now I'm sitting here worrying about my ghost baby. Is it lonely? I hope not. Next comment. My roomie/best bud is a mortician, and I'm around the funeral home a fair amount myself and know the staff pretty well. I've spent the night there before. Nothing weird happens there. I've had some experiences I can't explain, so I was a little surprised none of the staff ever had an odd experience, especially since some of them do believe in ghosts and whatnot. But they told me if ghosts were real, why in the world would they linger at a funeral home? It's just a transition space, like an airport. No one wants to just stay in the damn airport, haunt the place if you died, or the people you love, or the home you never want to leave, or however it works, if it works. Who would want to linger in a funeral home they have no attachment to, that their body only visited after they were already dead? The running joke at the funeral homes I worked at, on the IT side, was people would haunt the florists because of how much they would charge for shit that will die not too long after a funeral. I never had any paranormal experiences, but it was still a creepy place to work, mainly because I had to see the staff's browser history. Next comment. I used to work at an oncology ward as a nurse. Our side rooms were kept for end-of-life patients on palliative care, and one patient that we had been nursing for a good few weeks died early one morning. Last offices had already been done by the night staff, and the patient moved to the hospital morgue, so all that remained was to clear the room of personal belongings and tidy up. I sent a student nurse that I was mentoring at the time to do this whilst I got on with the drug round. The student had known the patient fairly well and was comfortable with this job. About 10 minutes after a colleague came to me and told me that my student had come flying out of the side room white as a sheet and was sobbing in the staff room. I went to find out what the problem was, and the student told me she had been cleaning out the sink area in the bathroom, had glanced up and seen the deceased patient reflected in the mirror looking at her over her shoulder. My student was a sensible girl, not given to hysterics, but for the remainder of her placement on that ward, she would not go near that side room. Reply. There's a name for this phenomenon. Like, if your dog dies, you'll constantly think you see him for a while after. And not just think you did, people will be absolutely sure of it. I still occasionally feel a cat that isn't there rub on my legs in the exact pattern my childhood cat did. Don't care if it's psychosomatic, I choose to believe it is him. I had my old cat, my soul cat, put to sleep at home, and I hand to heart swear he stuck around for several days after. I could feel him nearby at times, and not just when or where I expected to find him, but randomly. When my other cat passed 6 months later, I didn't have that feeling at all, although I miss her a bunch too. She was just gone. Next comment. I'm a palliative care registered nurse who didn't believe in this stuff until I became a nurse. I have 3 to share at the moment. The first one. Before my time in palliative care, I worked on a medicine unit at the hospital. One night, I was returning from my second break around 3 a.m. or so and saw a man standing in the door of my patient's room. He was white, late 40s to mid 50s, dark hair which was graying, relatively fit, wearing a hospital gown. He was standing at the door with his arms crossed, and as I walked closer, he turned and went inside the room. I followed because I knew it wasn't his room. Our unit was big. It had 36 beds, so it was entirely possible he was a patient I had not met yet. Anyway, you can guess the rest. Went inside the room and he was nowhere to be found. I looked under the beds, which is ridiculous because someone couldn't hide there, in the lockers, washroom, behind the curtains. He was nowhere to be found. Later that night, my coworker had said she felt like someone was touching her feet when she tried to nap on her break. The break room was right next to my patient's room, and she was in there at the time that I saw this patient. Number 2. Not a specific ghost story, but I just want to say 2 things about working in palliative care. First, patients often introduce me to deceased relatives around them or talk about people waiting or being in the room with them. This is an incredibly common experience, and I see it happen more often than not. Second, a lot of people know they are going to die imminently / choose when to go or wait for loved ones, and I believe much is seen or heard that folks don't talk about during this time. I believe this is because in our younger patients who aren't ready to go, there's often a high degree of anxiety, and many times I have been asked by a younger patient to help me, I'm going to die today, or similar. Like they have held on as long as they possibly could, and then something happens internally, or they see something around them which gives them a sense of knowing. Number 3. Once upon a time, I was doing home hospice, and a younger guy in his 50s was dying of occupation-related lung cancer. Anyway, I knew it was coming and asked his family if they wanted to invite anybody to say goodbye, so patient's 90-year-old father, brother, extended family and friends came over at about 1 a.m., and I left them and sat in the kitchen to give them privacy. As I'm in there, I hear this massive burst of wind chimes, which was kind of supernatural, as in did not stop, just a massive burst that went on and on instead of trickling here and there with the wind. A moment later, his daughter came in to tell me he had passed away. I don't usually share my supernatural beliefs about death and dying with families, but I couldn't help but comment on the wind chimes later on, and his wife said, "Yeah, he collected wind chimes. That doesn't surprise me at all," and turns on the light on the back patio, showing me literally hundreds of chimes which had been silent all night until he passed. Replies: Absolutely. I worked as a hospice nurse, and it didn't take long to see many people had control over when they left, waited for family to arrive, etc. I had one patient who went 3 days with no kidney function, pupils fixed and dilated, super low blood pressure, who woke up and told me she had seen the other side. We would see each other again, she would be able to watch my life, and she loved me. Told me to go home and rest because she was leaving by morning. 3 a.m. I got the call. Changed my entire outlook on life. Hospice was so wonderful with my mom in her last week of life. Near the end, she, a normally very active and on-the-go woman, kept trying to get up and walk around, repeating, "Come on, Phil, I gotta get up. I have to get up. We have so many plans." Phil, my dad, died unexpectedly in 2016, and her constant statement that day he died was, "We had so many plans." They'd been together 40 years before his death. My mother refused to die with me in the room. She had cancer for years and years, and I was her little best friend, as she called me as a baby. I didn't leave for 3 days except once to get food, and I was sick the entire time thinking of how bad I'd feel if she died and I wasn't there. I wouldn't even shower. I know it was gross, but I just couldn't leave her to suffer alone, even though she was comfortable thanks to some great nurses. My heart just broke over 3 whole days watching the suffering, and I was a sorrowful shell of a person. And finally, my grandmother told me to just leave the room because my mom wasn't going to let me see it. I fought, but she commanded out. She died within 10 minutes, and I did get brought back fast to talk to her for those first minutes as she passed. To this day, I'm told she wasn't going to let me see her die, knowing how hard I'd take it. Probably would have screamed if I saw her chest stop moving. Nurses, family, everyone told me the same. She didn't want her last breath to be my last memory with her. I had said many times with the cancer that I'd walk with her until I couldn't go anymore, but she cut me off early. I still thank my mom for that. My sister is also an ICU nurse. People wait and know. I believe you, and you should believe your mom. Sometimes they wait for people. Other times they want to spare someone. My mother was in hospice with lung cancer for a week before she died. The evening she died, I was sitting by her bed holding her hand. She hadn't spoken or moved in a couple of days. Prior days, she would have mostly indistinguishable conversations with people that had died many years before her. I heard her call out for Mama and Daddy, and even heard her say my father's name, though they had been long divorced. As I was holding her hand, she opened her eyes and said my name. It was so unexpected. It took me half a second to realize she was speaking to me. I said, "Mommy." She told me, "I'm ready to go home." I thought she meant home to her house, and I didn't know what to say, so I asked her, "Home to your house?" And she smiled at me and said, "No, home, home." That's when it hit me. This was it. I told her, "Okay, it's okay. I love you." And she looked away and exhaled. A nurse came in a few seconds later and I told her what had happened. She listened to her chest and turned off her oxygen. She said she'd wait a minute and listen again because her heartbeat was faint. She waited, and when she listened again, she looked at me and she said, "She's gone." And she was. The energy that was there only a minute or two before was gone. One of the most powerful and profound experiences of my life. Next comment. Not me, but a colleague found a dead person in a dark, smoke-filled, burned-out building during the mop-up of a firefighting operation. As unfortunately happens sometimes, you find them by stepping on them. If they're still intact, you kind of bounce off them. If they're fried, you can often crunch them up pretty bad under your heavy boot. Well, this guy stood right on a badly burnt corpse's sternum. Crunch! Right into the chest cavity. When he tried to pull his foot out, it got stuck on the ribs and the body came up at the same time. Burned up arms flailing about. Took him a few tries with what looked like a zombie stuck to his legs. He needed quite a bit of counseling after that. Poor dude. Next comment. My grandfather died a while back. One day, me and a bunch of my cousins were playing in the front yard. We live in a rural area, since on weekends all the family likes to hang out together. So we're out having fun and see Lolo, our grandfather, walking towards the house. We all greet him and he smiles at us. He walks up the porch into the house and hangs his hat by the door. We continue playing until we hear crying from the inside of the house and my uncle driving fast up the driveway. We all rush in to see what's going on and see everybody bunched up in the kitchen crying, telling us that Lolo died early that morning and they just found out. He lives a few towns away. We looked at each other and told the grown-ups, "Nah, we just saw him come into the house." They didn't believe us, and we told them that he really did not that long ago, and he even hung up his hat by the door. So everybody rushes to the door, and his hat was hanging right there where we said it was. He doesn't ever go anywhere without that hat. So me and my cousins are running all over the house calling for him while our parents are so quiet and freaking out. He actually did die earlier that morning, and my grandmother couldn't find his hat anywhere in their house. We left the hat where it was, and nobody ever touched it. Reply. Not the same thing exactly, but my grandfather died when I was in my early 20s. He and I were very close. I struggled with his death and barely cried at his funeral because I knew if I did, I wouldn't stop. A few weeks of me avoiding all mention of him and gruffly rebuffing well-meaning friends and family when asked about him, I dreamed the most coherent dream I've ever had. I was at his home, outside, which was my favorite place to be. My mother, grandmother, and all the rest of the family were inside. And then from his workshop, my grandfather came walking up to me and said, "Hey, princess," which was his nickname for me. And I was so happy in my dream because he was there, alive and well, and clearly this had all been a mistake. So I said, "Papa, let's get inside quick. Everyone will be so excited to see you." And he smiled real sad and shook his head and said, "Baby, I can't stay. I'm only here to see you, and I have to go back." And I said, "Why just me?" And he said, "Because we have to say goodbye." I woke up sobbing. I never dreamed of him again. But I will go to my grave convinced he did come back to say goodbye because he knew I couldn't let him go. Next comment. Not a ghost story, but when I was in the army, I served on a few honor guard duties for transporting soldiers' remains. One time, we were taking Korean War-era remains that had been uncovered in Korea and transported to the US for identification. For most of the remains, the transfer cases, which are industrial aluminum caskets, were very light, like you'd expect with 40-year-old remains. A couple of the cases were heavy, like a couple 100 pounds. I've never stopped wondering what was in those cases. It wasn't 40-year-old bones. Next comment. Mom told me stories when I was growing up. Her first job out of nursing school was as an RN in the ER of an old hospital in Virginia in the mid-1980s. There was the old man in the hat and patient 1. Most of the nurses had stories about them. The man in the hat would show up and stand outside of rooms after visiting hours. The patients often died soon after. Patient 1 was a woman in a very old hospital gown. She'd walk in the halls before entering random rooms. Those patients usually coded. They took the man to be an omen of death and the woman to be a heads up to grab the crash cart. Replies. The day my mom passed away, we were all gathered around her bed waiting for the moment. My fiance's sister, mom, and baby nephew showed up to offer their support. At 3:32 p.m., Mom passed away. I went out to see them and my fiance's sister said, "You'll never believe this. A few minutes ago, Noah was on the floor playing and he suddenly looked up and smiled, waved and said, 'Bye-bye.' He'd done that at 3:32 p.m. Next comment. I'm an ICU RN. We had a septic patient in the unit. She was 29 weeks pregnant. She went into labor on my shift and we delivered her baby, stillborn. I did post-mortem care on the baby, retrieved the proper transport container and walked the baby down to the morgue. It was the middle of the night. I'm in an elevator alone. I hear a baby starting to wail. I absolutely lose my shit and rip open the cover, and just as I go to zip down the bag, I hear a calming male voice say, "Hush the little one, I've got you. No need to cry." The crying stopped immediately. Shaking, I opened the bag and saw exactly what I expected to see. A deceased 29-week-old baby. I'm a big bearded 40-year-old ICU nurse, and that was the scariest shit I've ever experienced. No one believes me to this day. I don't even want to speculate what the crying or the voice was. God, even typing that out, I felt my chest tightening. Next comment. I have a million that are more grotesque and gory than this one, but it stands out to me. I was working once at a mortuary and had to go pick up a man from the medical examiner's office. When you do that, at least where I'm from, you get a receipt when they release the body to you. The receipt has all of the personal belongings that are with the deceased. When I brought the man back to the office, I opened up the body bag to make sure all the belongings were there and double-checking the receipt. When I opened the bag up, I was stunned to find this dude looked almost exactly like me. He was my age, had similar tattoos and similar spots, had the same long hair I do, even had the same style of jewelry I was wearing. It took me so off guard that I stood there in an existential crisis until the embalmer came in and was like, "Hey, how's it going? Holy shit, that guy looks just like you." It's the only case I've had nightmares about. I'll be the one in the body bag with the deceased man opening me up. Next comment. Not a worker in that field, but when my dad was in the hospital, I turned off the ringer on my phone and fell asleep. About 1 a.m., I heard the doorbell ring. I got up. No one was at the door. I walked around the house and saw absolutely nothing. I checked my phone and turned on the ringer. Almost immediately, the hospital called to tell me my dad had died and would it be okay to harvest some of his organs for transplant. Next comment. Back when I worked in cardiology, we had this one single room at the ass end of the floor. We'd put palliative care patients or patients that needed isolation in there. I swear 3 different patients in the years I worked there told me they had woken in the middle of the night and seen an old man and a little girl holding hands, both standing at the foot of the bed, doing nothing. Next comment. I used to work in a nursing home. The residents in certain rooms would complain about a man in their room at night, but hallucinations are common in the elderly, so it wasn't really noticed. One night, I was mopping the dinner room floor, which had huge windows looking over the garden. It was around 1 a.m., so pitch black outside and low lighting inside. I had this horrible feeling of being watched, so I looked up and reflected in the window was a man behind me. He had a brown suit on, a bowler hat, and the cruelest look on his face. He grinned and his mouth was too big. This happened in seconds, and when I turned around, there was obviously no one there, but I'll never forget the look of that evil on his face. I paid more attention to the residents after that, and they'd all seen the same man. He just enjoyed terrorizing people. Next comment. I used to work as a nursing assistant in assisted living communities. Usually, when a resident started to need hospice, they were transferred out to a higher level of care, so I didn't see death for a long time. When I first started, my favorite resident, let's call her Marilyn, would play Scrabble with me. She was completely alert and oriented. Sometimes, she likes to sit quietly with an iPod Shuffle clipped onto her vest and these huge headphones. She loved music. Slowly, she started to decline. I would help her get ready for bed, and she would get upset when she forgot how to do something. The only thing that calmed her down was playing music off my phone. She liked Frank Sinatra and the Beatles. Her independent ability declined rapidly, and soon she was bedridden. Still loved listening to music. This was during COVID, and her quality of life was diminishing so quickly that we didn't transfer her out. She had an apartment at the facility with all her belongings where she was comfortable. By the end, her dementia had progressed to the point that she couldn't remember how to swallow. Marilyn passed away with me, the head nurse, and her family at her bedside in her apartment, Unit 202. I did her post-mortem care afterwards, styled her hair how she liked to wear it, even clipped her little iPod onto her shirt. A few days after she died, a woman in 203, her neighbor, kept wandering into the lobby during night shift, always at 3 a.m. She complained of loud music coming from Unit 202. That apartment was vacant, just full of Marilyn's belongings. She said the music was so loud it was deafening. Whenever the night shift worker went to check, he didn't hear anything. Not really creepy, more just sad. I miss Marilyn. Next comment. I worked in ward nursing for 10 years. The spookiest thing that happened to me was a doctor hiding under the bed when I cleaned my first body and scaring the shit out of me. That definitely helped me get over the fear factor of working with the dead. Bodies groan and leak when you roll them to clean them, but that's normal. You just talk to them nicely as if they were still alive, like, we're just gonna put you in your nicest pajamas for your son to come and say goodbye. I'll give your face a clean. I'll paint your nails fresh as I know you like them this way. On most wards, there was a haunted room that staff members would avoid. They all said it was haunted because the buzzer would mysteriously go off by itself. Funnily enough, it would always stop buzzing randomly after maintenance came to fix it. Next comment. I was an RN and was working in a very well-off town in MS. The hospital had 2 ICUs, with the second one being an overflow-type unit on the 3rd floor. There were 7 rooms in that unit, and room 2 was haunted. Numerous times, different nurses watched something walk into the room, but the room would be empty without a patient in it. One time, a nurse had an actual patient in room 2. It was about 4 a.m. and the nurse was going to do a dressing change. She took the stuff into the room and the patient asked what she was going to do. She said, "Change your dressings." The patient said, "Oh, no, that other nurse was just in there about 30 minutes ago and did it." The nurse looked and, yes, the dressing was fresh. She went out to the desk and told the other nurse, "Thanks for doing that." The nurse was baffled and said, "I didn't change the dressings." They both freaked out a bit. Rumor has it that an RN that had worked for the hospital a long time died in that room. The hospital is now a dorm for a big college, so fun times may be had by a bunch of college students. Next comment. My grandfather was extremely sick in the days leading up to his death. He'd worked with asbestos for all his working life and had an extremely debilitating form as a result of it. He couldn't speak, and he hadn't spoken for a month leading up to his death. He couldn't even communicate. On the day of his death, he looked at my mother and said, The angel is back. My mother was stunned. She asked what he meant, and he said, the angel is back, and this time he wants me to come with him. My mother looked at the corner of the room where he was looking, turned back to him and said, Dad, there's nobody there. He didn't respond. He died that night. That was 20 years ago, and my mother never spoke of it again. She told me the story when I was old enough, just like she told my brothers, but my sister never got to the age where she was old enough. She succumbed to her disease when she was 7 after battling it her entire life, and on the days leading up to her death, she kept speaking about this butterfly who would visit her. My brothers and I would sit with her and nod along. We kind of just thought she'd developed this imaginary friend to help her through what she was struggling with. One day, she shot up and told us, the butterfly is back, and he wants me to follow. I saw my mother's face drop. She made the decision not to tell my sister she was dying, and my sister just believed she was going through a rough patch like she often did, not that the doctors had told my mother it was terminal. But my sister said, in the next second, I'm going to die, aren't I? That's what the butterfly said. He told me I'm going to die. My mother admitted to her that, yes, she was going to die. She said, oh, okay, then laid down and died, with my brothers, my mom, and I cuddling her in bed. I don't know what I believe about the afterlife, but I have to think there must be one, that there's some truth behind the legend of the Grim Reaper, that at some point something comes to lead all of us away from life, because otherwise I have no way of coming to terms with what I've experienced. That's going to do it for this video. If you have any stories or comments on these ones, please leave a comment below. If you enjoy these Reddit stories, please like and subscribe.